Then you should have a white sheet of paper that is going to be what we're working off of for the next few weeks, quickly. And then we're going to spend some time on these interludes. That'll be where we spend the majority of our time this week and next week, and maybe even to the third week. Because once you finish these, you get to really the last part of the book, which is just is the restoration or the culmination of second coming and what that looks like for heaven and for earth. So let's pray and we'll begin. Oh God, what we do is we ask, oh Lord, that you'll take our time of study and our time of being together and allow that to be informative for us, to help us to not just the renewing of our minds and so how we think, but also for our way of life. They both seem to influence the other. And so what we want to do this morning is give you all of who we are in hopes that in our time together we would grow more and more in your likeness. This we pray in the name of Christ. Amen. Okay. You have the introduction to Romans. I'm doing all four this morning, so it's going to be all woven together between sermons and Bible studies. In the book of Revelation, you have a basic introduction in the first chapter. You get a picture of Jesus, a brief picture, and then you get the churches. And Jesus is among the churches. He's walking in the middle of the churches. They are going through, they're going through or about to go through a time of persecution. And the word there for some Bibles is persecution. The word in another translation might be tribulation. It's the same word. And so the idea is that of persecution. And then you get into 4 and 5, and you get this wonderful picture. And it's you get a picture of God's transcendent in chapter 4, which means God is above creation. God is separate from creation. And then in chapter 5, you get a picture of God's immanence, which God is among the people, among the parts of creation. And 4 and 5, or if you look at 4 and 5 together, that's a complete picture of worship of God, where God's transcendence and His immanence are held in balance. And what holds them in balance is Jesus, which is that is a core teaching in all of the New Testament, where you see God's separateness, God's holiness, and you see God's immanence, God being amongst the people. You see that best in 4 and 5, and the picture on both chapter 4 and chapter 5 is really the picture of this Lamb who is victorious and yet slain at the same time. And then you get into chapter 5, then you get into chapter 6, because at the end of or part of that part of worship is that the only person who can open up the scrolls, which is the beginnings of judgment. The only ones who can open up that is Jesus. People can't, only Jesus can. And so from 6 was when he opens up the seals. From 6 to 19 is the complete picture of what judgment would look like. Now, John last week talked a little bit about how this has been interpreted throughout the history. The overwhelming majority of people have, or at least when I say orthodox, orthodox is just a word that says it's right belief. The idea is that it's middle of the road. That's the picture. The orthodox interpretation of the seals, trumpets, and the bowls is not that they're separate as in independent of each other, but they are just a picture of one complete judgment. And so you have in the yellow sheet, if you notice how they're all, the one that has, can I borrow your sheet? The one that looks like this, you see how they're all just part of one big square? I mean, the idea is that they're just all a part of God's judgment. And so the idea throughout the history of the church, on down the middle of the road, is that the bookends are, you have what takes place of worship before the judgment, and then when we get to the end, it's another picture of worship. God is with the people, and they're worshiping God. And so they're the bookends to, but the majority of the middle of the book has to do with this concept of judgment. And there are three aspects of the judgment, but it's part of one complete picture. So the idea, and there's a minority view that says, well, the seals are judgment, and then there's a long period of time, and then the trumpets are judgment, and then there's a long period of time, and then the bowls are judgment. That's held by a small part of the people in church history. Actually, it's very late in its inception. The majority is this is just one big picture. And what John is doing, if you can imagine, if you had to write, say if you walk out of the church and you see two cars on Wildwood crash into each other, and you had to write about it, you would write about it in, well, I saw this, mean the full picture, not just the two cars crashing. That would be easy to write about. But everything that was going on while those two cars were heading to each other, you would probably have to find a way to write about that one picture. And when you're writing it down on a sheet of paper, it's going to look like, well, I saw the birds flying over here, and I saw this car coming this way. What we would assume is that this is the start, and then when you get to the, over here and you talk about the other car, you'd say, okay, that's secondary, or there was a time distance before you get to this. They're happening all at the same time. You're trying to describe one event, and so it comes across as being this happens, and then a long period of time, and then that happens. But that's not the way that the majority of the church has interpreted this season or this passage of judgment. It's part of one picture that's kind of going on at the same time. Apocalyptic literature is not a chronological work. The characteristics of that type of literature is not like the historicals, like the 1st and 2nd Samuels and the 1st and 2nd Chronicles, where you have one king and you describe what takes place under that king, and then he dies, and then you describe what takes place under another king, and then he dies. And so you might get a book in the Bible that talks for hundreds and hundreds of years. That's not this style of writing. This style of writing is not consumed. Numbers are not literal. What's an attribute of this type of writing, or a characteristic of this type of writing, is that numbers are symbolic, figurative. And so the idea that when we read, just because we read about the seals in 5, and then we move to the trumpets later on, and then we move to the bowls, it's not to draw the conclusion that this happens, and then there's a long period of time, and then that happens, and a long period of time, and then that happens. That's not the way the book is set up. So historically, that's the church has shied away from this understanding that they're all completely separate. What is also interesting, these are just kind of like some overarching concepts, is that this judgment is bathed in grace everywhere you look. The grace, actually, when the bowls come and it's rounding the corner and heading for the home stretch, that's when it's hard, that's when you don't see grace anymore. That's at the very end. And so in all of this, you have just multiple pictures of grace, to where even when fallen Babylon is living into the repercussions of their actions, God still limits how painful it is and gives it a season. And so the larger picture is that even in the midst of all this judgment, there's a great deal of grace, which is really fascinating to me. Grace shows up all throughout this book. Now, there are at least two major themes that show up in the book of Revelation that can give us insight, or at least be a lens by which we see these judgments. The first one, we've talked a little bit on this, and that is the concept of time. Greek understanding was the idea of cycles, so where you have like something would happen and then it would come back up and just kind of run over and over and over. In a Jewish understanding, they don't operate that way, and that would have been at least the context by which John writes the book. So for a Jewish understanding, there is this concept of logic or at least linear, but it's not tied to chronological time, as if to say, okay, from 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock, that obviously comes before 3 o'clock, but 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock in a Jewish mindset, at least when they're writing, could be an eon. And then 3 o'clock could come, which would be next on the line, and it might be a short district. It's not segmented to where, if you talk about it in terms of hours, that I'm giving you an example, in terms of, like, if we talk about it in terms of hour, to be the idea that, hour number 1 has the same time limit as hour number 2. Does that make sense? All right, help me out on this, because I don't teach from a manuscript, and so if it's logical in my mind, by the time it gets out to you, because of my tongue, it might not be logical in your mind. So you have this idea of, particularly in a Judeo-Christian concept, that there was something that was called time, kind of like times of woes. You might have heard Jesus in the Gospels talk about, these times of woes. That time frame is not defined. And so you might have a long period of times of woe, and then when that time is over, whatever the woe or whatever it is that brings the woe comes, well, that might be short. Or you might have an idea that times of woe, which comes before whatever the main thing is, the times of woe might be short, and then whatever brings in the times of woe might be long. And so it might be linear, as in one coming before the other, but they're not equally, the times are not equal in duration. Maybe that's the best way to say it. I know I'd get to it sooner or later, but I just kept talking about it. And so you have a little bit of that going on here in the book of Revelation. In some translations, not necessarily translations of the book of Revelation, but in some translations of apocalyptic literature, the times of woes are also called birth pains. For instance, any of you that have had children, how long were the birth pains? I mean, were they 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 2 hours, 5 minutes? For some it's going to be real quick. For some, I've heard it's going to be a long time. The idea is that there's just a segment of time where it's painful. Well, then the baby's born, and it's not painful anymore. It might be a little bit painful, but at least the joy of the baby offsets the birth pains, correct? That's what's been told me, and I had the experience, so you have to tell me if I'm right or wrong. I'm going off what people have said, and I'm using it, so help me out, But the early audience, the first century, would be mindful of this concept of birth pains, and it not be tied to a chronological time as much as a season of time. And then whenever it is that is the causation of the birth pains, when that comes, the birth pains go away. And so there's that shows up in this idea that's kind of a larger theme to kind of view some of the book of Revelation. The second major idea in a Judeo-Christian understanding is the concept of Exodus. So, and this was probably a little bit, we're more familiar with this just because of our understanding of the Old Testament. Go back to your Sunday school lessons of Moses and Pharaoh. What the Exodus is about, it's about God and Pharaoh having a standoff. This is the battle at the OK, or the gunfight at the OK Corral. And so when you have this, and the reason why is because Pharaoh actually literally means big man. And what Pharaoh did at that time was the major superpower in that area. Pharaoh said, I'm God. I'm the incarnation of what it's like to be God. For instance, when Moses, in Exodus 5, when Moses and Aaron go to Egypt, they go to Pharaoh, and they say, what God has told them to say. Pharaoh's response? He didn't come check with me. Who is this God? He didn't come and consult with me. And so the idea is you have God and Pharaoh about to duel it out. And the plagues are the dueling. I mean, there's some plagues that Pharaoh does, right? I mean, of Correct? Hopefully? Shake your head. This is where you say yes. Okay? Because we have read Old Testament, right? So we're going to make that assumption. Well, I mean, the easy one. Moses comes down, he throws his staff down. What happens? This is the biblical jeopardy. Turns into a snake. Then what does Pharaoh do? He calls his guys and they come up, they throw their staffs down. What happens? Now, then what happens after they're all snakes? One snake eats the others. And, but it's always, God superseding or overcoming what Pharaoh does. And so there is that concept that shows up of where you've got, to lack of better words, you've got Pharaoh, who is something that is setting up himself to be on same level as God, and God and Pharaoh play it out. And when you get to the book of Revelation, you have fallen Babylon that sets itself up, who has its own rulers, but they set themselves up on par with New Jerusalem, or those who belong to God, and the rulers of that place, they're about to fight it out. And so that's the sort of the theme. Now, this is the grace element. This is one of the ways you can see the grace element in all this. Even in Pharaoh, and also in the book of Revelation, the plagues or the seals, the trumpets, and the bowls always have a redemptive purpose. What was the purpose of the plagues? To soften whose heart? Pharaoh's. For what purpose? So they can go and worship. And so you have the same thing that shows up here in the book of Revelation. The concept is it's a showdown. I mean, you have these two realities that are set apart. One is trying to set itself up on the same level, and you have basically a showdown that takes place. And God is acting, and the people are acting, and it comes across like plagues or something similar to that. But the purpose is always to be redemptive, which on one level is so destructive, because even when God is gracious and the desire is want to soften people's hearts, to use the Old Testament terms, people will still choose their own sense of destruction even when God is trying to be gracious. Now, that's not just something that shows up in Revelation. That's something that we're very much familiar with. Do you know anybody who ever struggled with addictions? Well, that's a struggle. And where people who have moved and guided and directed and done everything that they can in order to help, in order to save, in order to prevent, and yet someone still chooses something that is destructive over something that can lead to health or to lead to wholeness. This is real. And so it's not just something that we read in a book or we read in the passage. The people who are setting themselves up, I mean, this is real life. This is us. And so it might not be in the form of addiction, but there isn't any of us in here who can stand up and say, I don't have that problem. I can see the handiwork of God and see God's graciousness, and I always choose that. Normally what happens is we choose something else, and it's painful. And what happens with the pain? The pain sometimes can be a reminder to go back and try it someplace else, to try a new passage, a new way. This is very important to me, or I think it's really pretty fantastic, for lack of better words. In the middle of this showdown that's going on, God is never seen as nervous. All right? And the way you know that is that the verbs that are used. The verbs that are used when they talk about what God is doing, they're active verbs, which means God is the direct one who's doing the action. The verbs that are used to describe either what Satan does or what the beast or all those things, they are not active verbs. Whenever it refers to Satan, Satan never has an active verb in the book of Revelation. It's something that's called the middle passage. And the idea is that someone is allowing the action to take place. That's fascinating to me. All right, I mean, just think about that for a minute. God is never nervous in all this, and so whenever and so if you're, there might be one person in here It wouldn't be me. So, I mean, there might be someone else who's a Greek scholar and could pick that up. I can pick it up by getting out my commentaries and getting out my old seminary Greek notebooks and going through and circling and then looking for the ending and looking it up and say, oh yeah, that's Middle Pat. It'd take me forever. But if you are reading this and this is your first language, you would pick this up in a heartbeat. And so what you have is, even in the way John is describing, even with verbiage, he's setting the page. Remember, he's writing this to a church that has now inherited a new emperor who's about to call the dogs. He's going to let them go on Christians. And so there's going to be a sense of persecution. And so even when he's reading this, whenever it talks about God, even in the verbiage that's used, has power, has might, and those that are on the other side, they do not. They have power only because power is given to them. That's different, and it's limited. All right. Any questions or comments on that so far? All right. Yes, ma'am.
Just remind me, is John writing this while he is on Patmos, he's in prison?
Yeah. The question is, when is John writing this? And the answer is, he is in exile on Patmos.
So he is enduring.
Yeah, he's in prison now. I mean, it's not the same. It's not an easy life, but I mean, yeah, he's house arrest, but he's house arrest in the Bahamas. I mean, there is, it's not. It wasn't perfect. That sounds better than what it is. But I mean, it's not house arrest in Ephesus, it's on an island. But it's house arrest. You were responsible for your own livelihood. I mean, there wasn't social systems to feed or whatnot, and so you were responsible for your own clothing and all those things. So I mean, you wouldn't sign up for this lifestyle, but it could be worse, if that makes sense. Good question. The next thing I need is more of a practical. Will someone raise their hand when we're at 10:40? Just so that I'll. Okay. Hopefully we have a bunch of folks who can do that. That'll be my cue to wind it down, and because I'll need to transition. All right. Chapter 6. We get into the Lamb. Notice the Lamb is the only person that opens the seal, and so. The way the seals are laid out in the book of Revelation and the way the trumpets are laid out, they follow the same pattern. Now the bowls are a little bit different, mainly because when you get to the bowls, I mean, we've rounded the corner, we're heading for home, and they're coming quick, just like this. But in between the seals, John places these interludes. The first seal is a picture of Christ. Remember, God is now giving his judgment. And so, I mean, the Lamb is now coming in force. And the reason why we know that is that Christ being the first seal is because in the book of Revelation, only the terms conquering are used to describe Christ's activity or people who are associated with Christ. Remember when we looked at the churches and with the 7 churches, the plea at the very end, if you conquer, and this is Jesus saying, conquering with me, then the crown of life, or this would be set aside for you. But that word conquering is used to describe Christ and those connected to Christ and their activity. Also, the color white is in this style of literature, apocalyptic literature, is associated with holiness. And you have conquering, to conquer, which the meaning is that it's going on now and it'll go on into the future, but it'll have its consummation. Notice that when it describes Christ in the beginning of chapter 6, the one on the horse has a bow. Now, most of the time when you see a bow, what do you think of? It's a weapon, right? All right. In Genesis, what is a bow? All right, what does the rainbow stand for? It's covenant. All right, and so what you have in Genesis, in Revelation, is that the bow is not a weapon as much as it's a sign of the covenant. In the Septuagint, which is the Greek version of the Old Testament, It's the same word that is used to describe Genesis 9:13 through 17. And that's a different type of bow than a bow that would be used to be like you're shooting something. The image is that of God's covenant, that God is not coming to destroy creation in rebellion, but to conquer that rebellion through the death of the Lamb. I mean, so there's grace mixed in to the middle of even judgment. In the second seal, you see the effects of people living in rebellion. It's war. People, think about just rebellion in general. How does rebellion, just in human nature, play itself out in the world? Most of the time it shows up in war. A lust for power, a lust for authority. And so you have the effects of that showing up in the second seal. In the third seal, you see a continuation of the people wanting power. If it's not, normally when that shows up, you see it first in war. You also see it with economic oppression, which is not just something that we see in the book of Revelation. I mean, how often have you seen when people set up rule inside even our century, and they establish themselves as an absolute ruler where they're dictating all the shots? When has it ever been fair economically in any country? Yeah, exactly right. How about never? When has it ever been? Just get outside of our century. When has it ever been?
But they keep trying.
That's exactly right. So he said it, we keep trying. The fourth seal is death, and what you see there is the effects of what seals 2, 3, and 4 are natural outcomes of people wanting to be God. And it always manifests itself in wanting to control other people. And so maybe if the first seal is Christ, and Christ comes, I mean, one of the things that the presence of God does is it reveals what's on the inside and what gets played out in the world. For instance, have you ever been in worship and become aware of, oh my, I'm in His presence? Which normally then means that He's much bigger, I'm much smaller, and so often in my life, normally then plays out all those things that remind me of how small I am. It's a natural outcome. So God is trying to teach, and this shows up, this is consistent with all of Scripture. God is trying to teach all that when we live wanting to be like God, what happens naturally. I mean, there's senses of war, there's senses of economic oppression, and it normally ends in death. It's not just something for Revelation, or something that we, if you want to say, if you're a futurist, you're trying to give a picture of the future. This is now and not yet. When you get to the fifth seal, there's a change. It has to do with the martyrs who are crying out. Now, this is something we don't know, that we have to speculate here. We don't know if they are just the martyrs at the result of this emperor, or if they're the martyrs all throughout time who have followed God, or they're just the ones in John's day. We don't know. What we do know is that the answer is just a little while longer. That's what we do know. And also notice where they're at. They're under the altar. So if you go back and read some of your Old Testament passages that have to do about altars and how that stuff is all set up, the altars are set up for the presence of God. That's where God does His activity. They're under that as a sense of they're with God. They're in God's presence. The sixth seal, Christ appears as a heavenly warrior, again on a white horse. This also shows up in chapter 19 of the book of Revelation, verse 11 through 21. Jesus is ushering in God's judgment that'll bring all things to an end. And the sixth seal is a foreshadow of God's victory over the rebellious order. In 6:12 and in 16:18, these are the first and the last mentioning of earthquakes. You don't find them in passages other than this one. And it's the only time that islands and mountains are disturbed. And so the idea is that God is disrupting all of the falling order with his presence. Now, I want you to think about the number concept for a minute. We talked a little bit about this, I think, in the first week, where if God is going to give judgment, what would be numbers that would be assigned to show perfect or perfection in judgment? 7. The numbers that show up in the Old Testament which is, again, coming out of a Jewish mindset, a Jewish concept, which is what John was. The number 7 is perfection. The number 3 has to do with a complete time or a whole time. And so if you were John and you're going to describe complete or perfect judgment, whatever you would use to describe it, you would probably give 7 of them, correct? So what happens when the 7th seal comes? What does it do? You look at your chart. It opens up what? A whole other 7 of something else. Trumpets. All right? When you get to the last trumpet, you think, okay, we've really summed up what it means for God's judgments. We got 1 7. Now we got 2 7s. What happens when the 7th trumpet sounds? You get 7 more things. So you have 3 sets of 7. Now, if you are a first century Judeo-Christian, I mean, your mind is hot wired for this. And so when you see this idea of 3 or 7 and 3, it's a complete, whole, perfect judgment. Does that make sense? And so when we get to, at the end of the 6th seal, you would think that, that on the 7th seal, whenever that's broken, that will be the end, and here comes New Jerusalem, and we're all good. But it opens up a whole new set, and you get those 7, and when you get that last one, that opens up a whole new set. It's not till the last bowl till you get the culmination and it over. But in between the 6th seal and the 7th seal, and in between the 6th trumpet and the 7th trumpet, you get these interludes. Now, how many of you love plays? All right? You like to go to plays? New York? Good place there? What is the purpose of an interlude? You know? Any theater majors? So they can change the stage? Yeah, that's one reason. It's rest, but it also is to bring the audience up to speed for the next act. Okay, we're about to have to quit. And so, particularly in Greek mythology, the plays that show up in Greek mythology, they would have interludes, and the importance of interludes is that they are to give the audience a message, an update, so that they would have enough information for the next part. And so this first interlude, we have this idea of people who are sealed, and it's a long list of numbers in chapter 7, not Numbers 7, but Revelation 7. And in Revelation 7, lots of numbers. And the importance is not that there are who's in it or from what tribe or how many numbers, but what's happening. God is protecting. God is protecting those who have aligned themselves with Him. And before the 7th seal comes into focus. What's interesting is that even in the face of persecution, and even in the face of brokenness and the effects of persecution or the effects of brokenness, God still upholds, God still cares. Not that we would, but this would be a great passage to read at a funeral. I mean, it doesn't sound real funeral-based, and that's not what we're used to, but the image is perfect. Even in the face of things that are going wrong, God still cares. God still protects. God still guides. And then when you remember, or if you hold into place the fact that John is writing to a church that's in the middle of persecution, who are asking questions, why is this happening? What is this going to mean for me? He doesn't tell them that there won't be suffering. That's not what takes place here. But what he does tell them is that God cares. And God will be faithful, and God will watch over. In chapter 7, the verb tenses change from past tense to future tense. So, it's particularly around verse 15 and 17. The faithful are presently before the throne of God, and they are worshiping continually in His temple. God cares for them, and God will lead and guide, and the Lamb will shepherd them. This is a picture of that. There's this idea of the four winds that show up in 7:1. We really have no clue what that is throughout the church's history. There are a ton of guessings at it, and it's all over the place. But this is the only time that it's used in the Scriptures. And so we can't use previous Scriptures to define it. You have this idea of earth and sea. They're code words for places that symbolize the rebellious order. And so what's interesting is that God, that you find God coming, that you have this idea of whenever Jesus comes, Jesus puts one foot on earth and one foot on sea, as if to say those symbols that John has used to describe the rebellious order, Jesus can fully stand on both of those and make himself king. And then lastly, there's this idea of trees. Trees have all kinds of symbolism that show up in the Scriptures. In the Old Testament, and you can reference this in Deuteronomy 12, in Isaiah 57, Ezra 6, Hosea 4, trees are symbols of idolatrous worship. And so if you look at the idea of what those four winds are doing, they are standing against this fallen Babylon and all the parts of it. You have this idea of forehead. Up here, forehead. Forehead is understood as the location of a person's capacity to perceive. And so one of the things that God is doing, He's sealing upon the forehead. He's shaping, the idea is that God is shaping the person's life into the likeness of Christ. And so the seal that rests upon the person's forehead is the idea of God shaping, helping them perceive what He's doing. So this first interlude is real small, and it's really difficult to understand, mainly because we don't have any prior references to it. We have some biblical images that we can draw from in the Old Testament, and I've mentioned those, but there's still a lot that we don't know, particularly with this idea of the four winds, where they're at, where they come from, what they mean, where they symbolize. It's just not mentioned. And you can read a host of information from that they're, like some angelic spirits to all kind of things, and draw your own conclusions. I mean, it's all over the place, but we don't know historically what they mean. Well, let's stop here. Next week we're going to pick up with the trumpets, and we'll follow the same pattern. We'll go through the trumpets briefly, and then we get into the second interlude, and that is 4 chapters long. There's a lot of information in the second interlude. I don't know if John has mentioned this, but I will entertain these. If you have questions or comments throughout your personal study of the book of Revelation, or if you go back and witness this, or rewatch it, or listen to it on the website, and you've got your Bible out, you're going through it, and you've got questions, feel free to email us. And maybe we can get a list of those and either address them or write about them. We want this to be as easy as possible for everyone. Okay? God bless. Go in peace.